I just want to say a little bit about this theme, then, resting in the flow, which all of your comments were very helpful. And several of you were speaking about, the capacity to watch and to accept, and also even to watch and see the non-acceptance and the struggle and the resistance and so on. And when I when I came to meditation practice in the first instance, of course, like many people, I wanted to reduce my stress and live with as much flourishing as possible. But for me, there was also a sense of wanting to understand reality, of realizing that actually I had a very biased and limited view of what life was about, and an intimation that there was something more to it that could be experienced. And meditation practice, without my trying, catapulted me into that reality, in actually discovering that it was possible to watch thoughts or watch body sensations from this much bigger perspective than I was used to relating from. And I learned, somewhat painfully, but nevertheless learned, that I wasn't just my thoughts, that things were always changing, and that kind of things that I thought were immutable were actually not immutable at all. I also learned that the more I kind of grasped onto a kind of idealized view of life, the more it tended to kind of bounce back at me, like a sort of, a bit like one of those sort of, punch balls, you sort of punch it that way and it would come back harder and hit me in the face. So by pushing away reality, actually, I suffered more. And discovering that it's possible to notice and groove with the experience of life, even perhaps especially when it's not what we want it to be. As a number of people were describing in the experience of just those few moments of practice that we did earlier. So having discovered that, there were a few sort of propositions I was invited to consider that took this further. So the sort of proposition was made that what I was discovering, or what was being discovered, what is discovered in meditation, is a quality of awareness that's not actually affected by the ups and downs of life, that actually it was able to contain those. So, the possibility that, as John Kabat-Zinn sometimes puts it, my awareness of depression isn't depressed, and my awareness isn't depressed, and my awareness of pain isn't in pain. My awareness of anxiety isn't anxious. That there's some capacity to hold with equanimity and full awareness experiences that we have, and the sort of correlation of that being that therefore the me that I thought I was, up in my head, actually isn't me at all, because it's just a sort of a not exactly a sideshow, because it is there and it is very, very real and very present and often central to our living, but it certainly wasn't the whole story. And so it became clearer to me with repeated meditation practice that that it was possible to investigate this, and that the reality of things changing all the time, including ourselves, to recognize that we are very much, that what we call ourselves is actually largely a product of accidents of biology and physics and history and geography and family and culture, all coming together to manifest in this moment as what I'm calling me, or you're calling you right now, which is a helpful construct. But if we get caught up in that construct of I am like this, you know, I can't stand pain, for example. Well, if you're in pain right now and you're present and you're alive, then you're standing pain. Maybe not happily, but actually, you know, these can bring with this kind of view of ourselves can bring with some very limited concepts that are actually handed down to us, perhaps by our families or by our, you know, school teachers or by the television or by wherever. And that maybe we don't have to be so bound by those if we are able to do this actually quite simple thing, but rather revolutionary thing of watching, of observing and holding our experience with a bigger view. And that's not easy to do, of course, because you know, we're very habituated and attached to this idea of me. It's you know, we spend a lot of our lives in what the neuroscientists call the narrative mode, the default mode, in the kind of midline frontal areas of the brain that are active by default. That's why it's often called the default mode network, and which is what happens when we're not paying attention, which is much of the time. It's just kind of me. How does this relate to me? You know, what does this situation mean for me? And so we practice that a lot automatically. So it's rather difficult to stay in this place of this bigger place of awareness where we're actually observing our experience in a more spacious way that is not attached to or aversive from what's going on. It can just hold it a bit like a, you know, like a parent holding a crying baby, or indeed delighting in a smiling baby. Maybe not even a parent, because actually most parents are not necessarily in equanimity when the baby's crying, you know, and they're probably not in, you know, non-attachment in the same way when the baby's smiling. Actually, I've heard this lovely phrase actually for awareness of being called grandmother mind, which I think is a really nice way of describing it, because if you see a grandmother's relationship to a child, you know, it's that further step removed, and yet totally loving, you know, and yet being able to say, oh yeah, I know this, I know what it's like to be the parent, and yet I'm not in that same place, I don't have that same role. So you know, grandmother mind is awareness. So that part's the resting, yeah, that capacity to, you know, to be the grandmother, say, oh, this will turn out okay, you know, kind of this crying fit, or, you know, this toddler tantrum, or that teenage this, that, or the other. I haven't got to that stage with my children yet, so I'm now talking about things I don't know about. But you know, the trust that even in these really difficult moments of painful growth that we all go through and are still going through, you know, as our, you know, being in a way a sort of adult children as we go through our lives, that trust that actually this can be learned from, and maybe even needs to be learned from, and we can hold ourselves with loving kindness in the midst of the flow of life. All right, let me just try and sort of pull all that together, because I'm aware there's lots of different things going on there. So to summarize, perhaps, that by tapping into awareness, which is nothing magical, we do it every time that we drop into presence in meditation practice, where we notice the sensations of our breathing, or notice how we're feeling in our bodies, or we notice the experience of mental events passing through the mind. That's that awareness, that grandmother mind is already there. And by tapping into that, we can actually see how our experience is not as rigidly defined as we perhaps imagine it to be from our conceptual mind. We can actually drop into the flow of the waves of life. The waves of life inextricably interconnected and relational, because who we are depends on our past relationships and all of the, the kind of Indra's net, as it's sometimes called, of causes and conditions that have created this moment, and therefore enable the next moment to be influenced by the way that we relate to what's happening now. We can actually help influence what's going to happen next, not by thinking about it, but by actually engaging with this moment now. But in order to understand how to relate with this moment now skillfully, perhaps the first thing we need to do is to actually apprehend it by resting with it. And all of those words really just mean, let's sit and be. So we can kind of talk about it, and that helps, it kind of points to it, but in the end it's kind of blah blah blah, unless we drop into the real watching and feeling and holding and loving this moment as it is, as best we can. All right, so enough blah blah blah, and I'd like to invite you to practice with me for a little while.